Okay, good afternoon. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. Today I'm very pleased to have with me as my guest Emily Kapur, who's a partner at Quinn Emanuel. Emily, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, Emily, you have one of the more unusual backgrounds I've come across, which is you have, before you went to law school, anyways, you have a PhD in economics. Curious to know a little bit about what that PhD was about, and what was your goal in getting that PhD?
Yeah, happy to discuss. I studied economics in undergrad. I came from a family of lawyers. Both my parents were lawyers, and I
Hmm.
was trying to not become a lawyer. So I studied economics. I worked for a number of years at the Hewlett Foundation, doing kind of law and economics type work and nuclear security work, which were a little divergent, but. And then I went to London on a Marshall Scholarship and did a master's in economics, which convinced me I wanted to do the PhD. So I came back to the States. I started at Stanford to do my economics PhD. And I found it was exciting, but it was quite different from undergrad. You know, in undergrad, you're very much a consumer of knowledge, and you're learning all these new and exciting things and understanding new ways that the world worked that you didn't understand before. And that's it's a different posture from when you're learning to be a producer of knowledge. And I found graduate, especially the PhD program was a different experience from what I'd experienced before, in that I'd always done very well in school, and I was suddenly surrounded by this class of just brilliant classmates who were from all over the world, and they were respectively the very best mathematicians our age from Russia and Singapore and Italy and Brazil. I was very good at math. I don't think I was quite as good at math as a lot of them. And so then I started to think, do I really want to be an economics professor in the long run, which is what they were all there to do. And I wasn't sure that I was, really prepared to do that. Research is exciting, but it can also be very lonely if you're someone who really likes working in teams. So after the first year of my economics PhD program, I started law school,
Oh,
the
interesting.
third first year of graduate school in a row at Stanford. I did the first year of law school, but then I really did want to finish the PhD. I just, didn't think I wanted to be an economics professor. So after the first year of law school, I came back and I kind of mixed and matched law and economics together and wrote my PhD dissertation, and then ultimately ended up becoming a lawyer.
Oh, interesting. Well, what was your PhD on?
My PhD was on bank failures. I started my research around 2012, so it wasn't too long after the financial crisis.
Hmm.
And there was a lot of work happening at the time to figure out new legal mechanisms and regimes, that were statutory or regulatory, that could offer new and different opportunities for resolving large failing financial institutions.
Hmm.
And this was a really interesting area to me. In undergraduate, I had studied development economics, and I was raised with the Jesuits. I was very into kind of figuring out, is there anything we can do to help in the world, and I was less focused on something like finance when I was younger. But the global financial crisis was just such a moment for, I
Hmm.
was a younger person at the time, and the impact on economic growth was just catastrophic. I mean,
Oh.
it was by far the biggest crisis like that we'd seen since the Great Depression, and it had consequences for a decade thereafter, huge consequences for the world. And I sort of thought, if there's any research I can do that
Hmm.
could in any way contribute to a better understanding of how we avoid something like this, maybe that would be a valuable contribution. And
Hmm.
my advisor, John Taylor, was involved with a group that the Hoover Institution was running called the Resolution Project, and they had this really amazing group of law professors, economics professors, and then some partners at law firms, accountants. So it was a kind of mix of ivory tower and really practical people, the
Hmm.
former general counsel of the FDIC, the former general counsel of ISDA. And they were working on this project to design a new chapter of the bankruptcy code.
Hmm.
that would be specific to large failing financial institutions. They called it Chapter 14. So I became a member of this group, and then my dissertation research really surrounded the work that the broader group was doing, and tackled a couple pieces of the research questions coming out of that. So I had kind of two chapters to the dissertation. The first was an analysis of Chapter 14 as applied to the Lehman Brothers case.
Hmm.
And that was really interesting to me because I was also working on some litigation coming out of the Lehman Brothers case on the side. Um, and so the first chapter was sort of an economic history piece assessing exactly how Lehman failed and whether Chapter 14 or some other similar resolution mechanisms that were being discussed at the time could have solved the problems that we saw, could have, both addressed the moral hazard problems with bailouts like that used for AIG, while also, stemming some of the systemic consequences that were perceived to come out of the Lehman bankruptcy.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then the second part of the dissertation addressed sort of a follow-on issue, which is it's very hard to know when to invoke these resolution mechanisms. And often, there's pressure from creditors and shareholders and others to delay. It's usually going to be a policymaker who has to invoke something like this. And so the idea was, is there a better quantitative measure that we can come up with of market perceived insolvency at an institution like this that would give fair warning that the institution was, really heading for failure? And I designed such a mechanism. I empirically tested it. I showed, theoretically how it worked, and I came up with a rule applied to that measure that that at least in the historical data worked really well and better than anything else that was available at the time. So that was
Hmm.
the second chapter.
Interesting. Well, maybe it's too hard to summarize, but can you synthesize what the reason the bank why did the bank fail? Is it something you can summarize in relatively short short answer?
Yeah. Why did Lehman Brothers fail?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lehman did fail because of perceived insolvency,
Hmm.
and it was kind of remarkable in retrospect. It was actually pretty obvious that that was going to happen.
Hmm.
The if you really looked at kind of where bonds were pricing and shares, it was clear in advance of what happened that markets thought that their equity cushion was very, very small,
Hmm.
and they were planning internally weeks before they filed for bankruptcy to announce a large loss that the market didn't know about yet. And then
Hmm.
they announced that loss, and then everyone decided they were definitely insolvent, and a huge run began. And they lost about $30 billion over around a week
Hmm.
between runs by short-term lenders and margin calls and broker-dealer calls, clearinghouse calls. Um, but it was remarkable, really studying it, that that was kind of predictable. And what I did to study Lehman Brothers, it was really neat. There was Jenner and Block did an examiner report of the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, produced this huge report with, I think, thousands of footnotes, and then they made all of the documents that they cited available online on the Jenner and Block webpage, which was incredible as an academic at the time, because these are the kinds of documents that as a litigator we see them all the time, but
Hmm.
they're all covered by a protective order. Even if there's a public trial, there's only going to be a handful of documents that actually reach the public eye in the end. And so to really be able to get access to all of these documents that would normally be unavailable to an academic and under protective order was incredible, and helped me kind of piece together exactly how Lehman failed, and how public perceptions married up with what they saw internally at the time in the run up to that failure.
Is your PhD widely cited? Is it used in a lot of reference documents, or has it, does it get cited a lot?
Um, the first chapter was published as part of a book that the Hoover Institution put out in
Hmm.
connection with the Chapter 14 effort. And I think that did get a fair amount of attention. My thesis advisor, John Taylor, and I published a Wall Street Journal op-ed
Hmm.
that got a fair amount of attention. He went to Capitol Hill and presented on my research in particular, as well as some of the other things that the group was working on.
Hmm.
And a number of Congress people did Chapter 14 was never passed into law, but there were a number of bills proposed to pass it, and we got to work very closely on drafting that legislation. And I think in the end, the thinking coming out of the group had a big impact on how the FDIC intends to use its resolution authority that it was given through Dodd-Frank. And there was also a similar effort going on in Europe. So even though Chapter 14 didn't get passed into law, I think that we were part of a conversation that I think did have a pretty big impact on how people think about these issues today.
Yeah, definitely. So how did that PhD thesis or that research, how did that influence your area of law that you ended up going to? I'm assuming it had some effect.
It's funny before I finished my PhD, another thing that I was doing was I started working with a woman, Tanya Beater, who she was a lecturer at Stanford Law School, but she was also one of the very first derivatives traders on Wall Street. And she had her own financial consulting boutique, and she did kind of risk consulting as well as expert work and litigation consulting. I ended up working for her for about 3 years before I finished my PhD. And we worked on a bunch of cases together. I was supporting her as an expert. But two of the big cases that we worked on were two of the biggest litigations coming out of the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. And so there was this nice synergy between that work and my PhD work. So I worked with her on the Lehman versus JP Morgan litigation, and then on the Lehman versus Citigroup litigation. And the law firm that she was working with on those two litigations was Quinn Emanuel. So I was actually through her, I worked with maybe a dozen different law firms, and I summered at a different law firm. But the Lehman versus Citi case was about to go to trial right when I was finishing my PhD, and I loved the Quinn team that I had worked with for 4 years at that point. Led by Andy Rossman, who I just thought was, the most phenomenal lawyer. I still think that, even after working with him for a decade. And so, Andy and I kind of worked this out so that as soon as I finished my PhD, I could get to go to trial right away. And I did. I went to trial the day I started for 4 months on a case that I actually knew really well. And so that was just so much fun. Certainly in that way, the PhD research impacted things. I did another Lehman case after that. But then, everything coming out of the financial crisis started to slow, and things were good for a while. And they were particularly good in crypto, which I sort of fell into. It was another area where my PhD background was really valuable because there were all these really interesting questions coming up about market structure and trading and exactly how these new markets worked and what influenced prices and what didn't, and was there fake trading, what was that, what kind of impact was that having? So I found I was really well suited to a lot of the issues coming up in crypto, and I got to help develop our crypto practice starting in 2017. So we've really been in crypto for a while now.
Oh, wow.
And that was really exciting to kind of grow that practice. And then now it's all coming full circle. We have all these crypto companies who filed for bankruptcy and are in financial distress. And fintech. So I've been working on a team that's special counsel to the FTX estate for the last year plus. I'm also working some on the Genesis bankruptcy, and then I have a number of cases I'm working on actually with the FDIC, which is really neat to be kind of working for the FDIC in connection with the resolution of Silicon Valley Bank. So certainly I think those cases, all the resolution cases, insolvency issues, are very related to my PhD work. I was pitching a case the other day that related to these issues, and the attorney I was talking to heard my PhD background that happened to be a very close fit to what the case was about. She goes, "You're uniquely overqualified for this matter."
Well, I was just going to ask you whether clients kind of can notice that you've got this PhD. Is it helpful in getting the client's trust and stuff like that as you're talking to them?
I think it has been. I think I think it certainly gives me credibility in the finance world,
For sure.
which is typically where I'm operating. So I think it's been a big add, and certainly in the marketing context, whether I actually use my background day to day in the
Yeah.
case, it really depends on the case. I mean, there are certainly times where, I have had one case where we had like a true battle of finance experts, and that was the core of the case. And, we won it, and it was so exciting. And I got to work with a Nobel Prize winning financial economist, and
Yeah,
we
right.
worked out the math together, and then we beat the guy on the other
Right.
side. But that doesn't, most cases don't have that aspect. But I do think my ability to really understand at a core level sort of how these markets are working has been impactful and has influenced my relationship with clients and their trust.
What do your parents think about the fact that you ultimately became a lawyer now?
Well, they give me a lot of grief about it, but I guess it was inevitable at the end of the day. My
What?
sister is a lawyer too.
Oh my goodness. Well, what kind of law did they practice?
My dad was a trial prosecutor for the Department of Justice Antitrust Division
Oh wow.
in San Francisco, and he ended up becoming the head of that office for many years. So he was a prosecutor, antitrust prosecutor for 34 years, and then eventually he went into private practice for a bit.
I
And
see.
my mom was a deputy city attorney for the city of San Francisco,
Wow.
doing land use and environmental law for quite a while. She helped, build all kinds of things in the city that are part of the skyline today, which is pretty cool.
Oh, that's
And
really cool.
my sister is a litigator at Gibson Dunn.
Oh
So
wow. Wow, amazing.
yeah.
Those must make really interesting Thanksgiving dinners. That's all I can
We
say.
really try. My husband is not a lawyer, and he's like, no, 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 guys, we're going to talk about other stuff.
Well, do you ever see yourself like becoming a teacher or professor of either law or economics at some point down the line? I realize that may be many more years, but do you see that as a possible career choice at some point?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly when I was doing my PhD, that seemed like the most likely route. That
Yeah.
maybe I would become not an economics professor, but a law professor. Focusing on business and finance issues. Or maybe go into the policy world. But the Quinn opportunity and the opportunity to go to trial right away kind of fell into my lap, and I ended up here, which I never really expected to kind of make partner at Quinn and be a litigation partner. But it's been so much fun
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
I haven't really looked back. I did see a law professor over the weekend. He said, we're still waiting for you. You can come back. We can bring you back into the fold. And I would, if the right opportunity presented itself and there was a way to balance it with, with really being a litigator, I would certainly consider it. But I think I would miss the adrenaline of this job if
Yeah,
I, were to do it full time. My husband is a professor, so I also don't know if we can do two professors in the house. It just seems like a lot of professing for our poor children.
I realize you didn't design your career this way, but it does seem like that PhD and everything just seemed to fit so nicely into the career that you ended up having. I mean, it makes such a nice story. I really like it.
It really did, and
Yeah, it
I
really did.
certainly wouldn't have predicted it. I mean, there's no way I would have guessed that it would all work out this
Yeah,
way,
yeah, yeah.
and I guess that's the story for so many of us, right?
Totally, totally. Well, Emily, I really appreciate you taking the time. It was an interesting background, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share it with me.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on. It was a lot of fun to think back to what happened back then and all the mentors who helped me along the way. So thanks so much.
That's so cool. This is Richard Hsu and Emily Kapur. Thanks.